Hi, welcome to another session of the Somatic Healing Summit. I'm Ron Siegel, a clinical psychologist at Harvard Medical School in the USA, and I'll be your host for this session. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing a leader in the integration of somatic approaches to treatment with social activism, Dr. Amber Elizabeth Gray. Welcome, Amber. Thank you so much for joining the summit.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.
I'd like to start by sharing a little bit of your biography for people who may not be familiar with your work, and then we'll jump right in.
Okay, sounds perfect.
Dr. Amber Elizabeth Gray is a dance and movement therapist, somatic and human rights psychotherapist, and continuum and yoga teacher. Bridging clinical work, activism, and the arts, she brings a deeply integrative approach to healing in communities affected by systemic violence, disaster, and displacement. Her clinical, healing, educational, and organizational work endeavors to promote reciprocity and empowerment and incite meaningful change. Dr. Gray is the originator of polyvagal informed somatic and dance movement therapy, a survivor-centered, multicultural, and social justice framework that reflects many years of co-inquiry with her clients to understand how polyvagal theory promotes restoration and healing in the body, heart, mind, spirit for survivors of egregious human rights violations. Her Right to Embody framework, Body of Change, ecosomatic retreats, and clinical practice support therapists, artists, global citizens, and change makers worldwide. Dr. Gray is also the founding member of the Polyvagal Institute's editorial board and has been teaching this work worldwide for over 2 decades. So your work is at a very interesting intersection among important endeavors. Was there a particular moment in your own life that feels like it was meaningful or motivational for getting you involved in the work that you're doing today?
I think there are several. One thing that I always remember when I'm asked a similar question about the origins of this work, and I like to say our work. It's not mine. It's my clients. There are many mentors, including Dr. Stephen Porges and many other mentors as well. But my father, when I was in graduate school for somatic psychology and dance therapy, I had to interview my parents about my birth. And my dad said I was born dancing and fighting and never stopped. And both my parents reflected to me just what I would call activism, just a sense of being acutely aware of the cruelty of injustice and being dedicated to constantly reminding people. Annoyingly, at times, they would remind me how important equality and justice was, and it was for all species. It was animals, it was humans, and I recall just having a sense of that as a child and as a teenager, and standing up to bullies and making sure that I included folks in my very the term that we used to use, kind of white waspy, where I grew up, the town that I grew up in, is they wrote the Stepford Wives about it, inspired that. So just to give you a sense. So constantly, and I think that thread, whether that's something we come in on or that's something, I don't know where that came from, but I think that's the thread that I followed. And different experiences, an experience of a really intense car accident where, I was almost killed is what they said. And what happened to my body during and after that. My mom, yeah, I was she said shy and quiet before that. And I remember that part of me, but just this sense of commitment to something bigger that happened after that. That's when I became much more interested in the body and dance, and then also witnessing human rights abuses. I've been a Peace Corps volunteer. I've done a lot of work actually overseas, and actually once witnessed somebody being abused, tortured. I heard screams in the middle of the night and woke up and went outside, probably not wisely, but there's the activist, and witnessed and interfered and screamed at people who were, I won't describe what was happening. So just this paying attention, I think, and just being aware of how much wrongful cruelty there is, and naively, passionately, hopefully wanting to do something about it.
It is an interesting question that you raise about where exactly this comes from, because I mean, it sounds like your parents embodied this, but that begs the question of, so why do they embody it? What is it
Yeah.
that makes some of us humans notice these things and have an urge to do something about the injustice of the world, while others seem to notice it less so, or block it out, or manage it in some other way than through activism. What do you think makes
Mm.
us go down one path or the other?
I imagine there's probably a lot of contextual, ancestral, inherited influences. I think I can recall, again, just reflecting on my own experience, things that I didn't know as a child but were there. So both of my parents, I didn't know much about their histories. They would not have shared some of the things that happened to them. They both had really difficult childhoods. My father's was one of abuse, my mom's was one of abandonment.
Mm.
I don't know exactly what they did to step into being really amazing parents. Not perfect, because I don't think any parent is, and really amazing parents. So they did some work. I know I learned very at the end of their lives, because I was with both of them in the end of their lives, about some commitments and vows they'd made when they got married, to how they were going to raise children. But I often, there was a lot of that was silent and underground. My had ancestors that were indigenous who were intentionally silenced. My mother, she was first generation. Her father, my grandfather, came over from Poland and was made fun of and called, horrible names, that, Polak, things like that. Um, so there were things that they carried. And I think some of us might, it's uncomfortable, right? So I didn't know it here, but I think we all know these things, that memories transmitted in the body. That's when intergenerational trauma and intergenerational resilience equally as important as about. So we know things are transferred. I think there's still a lot of questions about how. So I knew that. Somehow I knew that. And maybe it angered me, maybe it drove me, maybe it inspired me, even before it was spoken. And I remember the day the light went off. I was working with an amazing woman, Engwyn St. Just, who's a works with social trauma, and she was helping me put the dots together. And I just remember going, "Oh my gosh, yeah, my mother was abandoned."
Mm.
I work with kids who live on the streets. I work with kids who are in gangs because they live on the streets. My father was abused. I have this strong calling to tend to people who've been violated. So it can seem almost too neat, but it's not that
Mhm.
neat. I think it's just, it's, and I think everybody probably does embody it. Maybe those, I'm saying this with absolutely no, judgment. Maybe it's our capacity, whatever our constitution is, our capacity for how we feel and work with the discomfort, and those little tendrils of truth that poke up through the soil, that, it's like, maybe not this lifetime, maybe another one. I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I also really appreciate your saying we don't know how this intergenerational transmission happens. There are more than one person in our field who will say, "Oh, well, it's clear it's epigenetics because we can see it in rodent studies that epigenetics exists, but we actually have no idea to what degree it might exist
Right.
in us as humans, and it is a bit of a mystery. Not so much a mystery, but more we don't know whether it's learning, observational, subtle communications, epigenetic. We don't know the mix of the factors uh,
Right.
that
Right.
transmit this. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, so since you have been working with the body and you've built on Steve Porges's work. Uh, the Talk to us a little bit more about what happens in the body, both when we. Well, let's start with where you just started here, which is simply when we observe injustice.
Mhm. What happens in the body? Again, I think it's probably the expression of it. I think there's both the neurophysiological, biological, mechanisms, the things that happen. And then there's our expression of it, right? How we move. I would say how our body is acculturated to express all those deep things that are quite universal. Um, I would hope, and I'm saying I would hope because of so many of the things that are going on now. I would hope that witnessing, I mean, I remember myself witnessing that horrible example of human rights abuse. I would hope that everything that was wrong about that, everything that was unnecessary about that would I don't want to would activate, would instigate would the our neurophysiological biological mechanisms of, I'm going to call it action, right? So fear, surprise, whatever we feel emotionally, action to do something about it, to recognize it as not in service of humanity, not in service of um, connection, and to do something about it, to feel perhaps outraged or upset. And this is a really interesting question because there's so many things going on today that people aren't people are instigating and people are celebrating that are actually very cruel. So that begs the question that I can't answer of, what's happening with that deep internal um, the guidepost, the neurophysiological guideposts of how human action is meant to be. So, at an autonomic nervous system level, right? Hopefully, it would be a sympathetically activated, fight or flight. It might be that dorsal, shutdown because it's so overwhelming. It might be a combination. We might feel like we want to move and we can't. All those things can happen. I think I'm going to step back into what you said, Ron, so brilliantly about we don't really know, some of the transmission and how things are carried down. I think there's also something. I'm just going to say, how open are we? How how willing are we to pay attention? I think there's a lot of distraction. I know I'm picking up different things. There's so many ways that we can be distracted now in a very fast-paced device, like overly inputted, lots of exteroceptive bombardment. Um, and I think there's a disconnect from we are a consequence. We are still a still unfolding, evolving moment in the pathway of evolution. And I'm a spiritual person, so this may not suit everyone, but I do have a sense of something bigger and bolder and more all encompassing and universal. So maybe it also has something to do with how much we're accessing that and sensing our connection to what's bigger, because that's a righteous space of justice. It has to be, right? Whatever breathed, or the fire that called in this intricate web of all living things. So, on that whole continuum from the moment that we feel something and trigger a cascade of hormones and neurological pathways and responses to whatever is holding us and reminding us of our place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, very interesting. You answered and raised so many questions at the same time there. I'm forgetting the name, but there's I think Hal something. Anyway, there's a prominent figure in the history of evolutionary biology, who was one of the folks who noted that the degree to which organisms generally will take risks for the benefit of other organisms often correlates to how genetically close they are. So the quip around this is, would you lay down your life for your brother? And they said, and this biologist who studied this said, and this is like many years ago, said something like, no, but I would for two brothers, eight cousins, probably for a child, etc.
Mm,
Basically making the argument that our instinct to care about the welfare of others is related to the selfish gene idea. It's related to, does caring for this other individual help to pass down my DNA? And it's a kind of reverse engineering of natural selection, right? That, well, the genes that wound up existing and being passed down in the gene pool were the ones that were associated with survival in some way. So that indeed our wish to take care of our kids is it's that, it's that wish to propagate our genes or two brothers because each has 50% of our genes, et cetera. That sounds terribly abstract, but it's so relevant to the degree to which we objectify others, right? Because
Right.
one of the reasons we don't act on injustice is we see the other, and I've got to think that's what's happening today with some of the almost like gladiator games cruelty that's going on in the world is those others are so different from me that they're no longer sentient beings, they're objects. So I wonder if you could talk about this whole tension between what you're talking about, which is feeling all of this bodily response to the suffering of others, and our capacity to not see them as me, as us, but to objectify them as actually an object.
It's hard because I have a hard time doing that. I
Mm,
have a hard time doing that. So, and certainly empathy being this human emotional and social response where we connect to other people. I've been with people who can do that, so I can sense into it. But it's interesting. Before I come back to that, as I was listening to you, I kept hearing this phrase, trusting the autonomic nervous system. And I just have to say, in terms of what we were just talking about, this is a question, but I wonder if for those that can instigate this cruelty, not respond to it, objectify others, what is it that happens where, we're not just an autonomic nervous system, and the power and the beauty of Steve's work and what my clients have taught me about how relevant it is that it's this internal pathway. The word regulation is so used in terms of how we feel, but it's regulating our actions. It regulates everything, our response too. I mean, broadening the definition of regulation. So does something happen where my switch to sympathetic puts me into more of an objectifying, you're the enemy, I'm going to fight you, versus I'm going to run in and try to get you out of there, which is what I did with that one person when I heard the screams. And the word trust, it's just, is there, what is the thing that switches so that we no longer trust or are connected to um, the deeper than like the deep biological wisdom of those responses. Stories get piled on, right? So I mean, this is getting to so many territories, sociology, psychology, I mean, so many different territories. But um how do we see human versus, well, I'm going to other that person, right? They're a different religion, they're a different skin color. Like, what is that moment? I know that's what you're asking me, and I think it's fear. And that might sound like very, I say that it's like, well, yeah, duh, it's fear. Fear has so many different expressions. I always say that I often wonder if most emotions are a subset of love and fear. It's fear. Am I going to flip into fear or into that love curiosity, which is much more open? And so that's patterning. I like to say that the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is pattern. It does absorb patterns. It's also possibility, right? So what is that flick? It's probably like a spark. It's like, oh, I'm going to go down the pattern. That person is that and that, so they must be wrong. And it's okay if they're hurt. They really don't matter. Or, oh no, same as me, no matter how different they appear.
yeah.
There's some loss. There's some loss of connection to deep bio wisdom, I think.
Or maybe, as you're suggesting, simply the activation of a neurological system that takes precedent, right? That fear tends to trump, so to speak, the other emotions, right? That
Yeah, yeah,
if we're afraid, we don't worry about lunch. The stress physiologists say you don't have to worry about digesting your own lunch when you're about to become somebody else's lunch, right?
exactly. Yeah,
And we don't worry about love so much. It's just like get back on the curb. The bus is coming, the bus is, about to hit me coming. And I guess, yeah, because demagogues know this, right? They say, be afraid of that bad other. And when we're afraid of the bad other, the compassionate response that's so deeply rooted for you kind of goes out the window for a lot of us.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because I think I talk about compassion. I've been thinking of it, and I've done some, when I say research, I'm not aligned with a university to do as much research as I'd like to do, but I've been researching this in the laboratory of my own body and my own inquiry and experiences that I have. I think of compassion as an evolutionary trajectory that we're on. And I remember, it was 2010. I don't know if you saw Jeremy Rifkin's video about the empathic civilization, and it was very interesting. And it was connecting mirror neurons and, the pathways and the shared body response. And there was a celebratory, wonderfully celebratory message that, we know we can be empathic, which we do. I mean, my understanding, I'm not a scientist, I'm a clinician. So, I understand it intuitively, sometimes scientifically, but this understanding that we're soft wired for empathy, we're all born with the possibility to develop it. Not everyone does, many factors for that. I have wondered if evolution's still unfolding. I don't think we're done. When I'm being cheeky, I always say, just if you've had a knee injury or a knee issue, you know that the body is still perfecting itself, right? And are we moving? Is that the direction that we're in, that we're moving towards? Because compassion, in my understanding of compassion, and I've actually talked to uh, colleague Sharon Salzberg, who, well known. I've studied with her and spent some time with her. In true compassion, cruelty is not possible. Empathy can be exploited in service of cruelty, right? Sadistic abuse feeds itself on the other's pain and suffering because that's what creates that twisted pleasure response. I've worked with this a lot in working with survivors of torture, and my clients taught me this. So that's the direction I hope we're going in. Um, and maybe it's, evolution. I've never loved the idea of survival of the fittest. I always felt it should be survival of the funnest, that there was some pleasure and love and choosing beauty and connection, not just, who's tough enough to make it. And I know that's adapted over time, but somewhere in that mix, do we choose compassion, or is the more primary the empathic thread, which can be twisted. So that was a lot again.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, it's certainly worth thinking about, um, in current times where it does not appear that, compassion is the leading motivator for a lot of public actions at the moment. And yet, you know, in the very long scape of human history, yeah, there have been a lot of developments that move us away from a dog eat dog world to,
Yeah.
to one in which cooperation and caring about one another um, seems worthwhile.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a
it,
both and. Yeah. Yeah.
Closely related to this, um, since you work with injustice and the like, there's individual nervous system regulation and dysregulation, and then there's what happens among groups of people, right? When whole groups of people's nervous systems, let's say, get quite activated and stuck in a kind of fight or flight response. What do you talk to us about that, and talk to us about how what you know from your clinical work might help us in working with groups, maybe even on the political level.
Um, so I think sometimes I like to simplify and simplify this. When we're talking about regulation, so self-regulation, and there's some people who push back against the idea of self-regulation because we learn to self-regulate, hopefully in meaningful co-regulatory ways. Not everyone has that opportunity. I do think that can be amended. I do think that can be restored. Um, I would suggest that the pushback to self-regulation, there's it depends on how we define self. Many of the communities and cultures I've worked with, self doesn't end at the skin, right? It extends to ancestors, planets, the natural world. That's how I sense myself. So we have these self-regulatory capacities that inform our ability, our willingness, our capacity to co-regulate. And I like to expand co to not just other, but community, collective, right? And self co, and I like to say global regulation. So I do think that there is a transmission, right? Human bodies, we communicate non-verbally through transmission. That's the autonomic nervous system. There is a transmission that happens when we're tending to ourselves that makes it more easeful to tend to others. And then that does spread and ripple. It's kind of a riff on neuroception. So, right, neuroception, that subconscious, um, autonomic gift of our evolutionary ancestors. We scan for danger, we seek safety, we don't have to do anything about it. Our nervous system, North Star, Southern Cross. And I'm working with a wonderful colleague, Dr. Nilufer Merchant, who's in Minnesota, and we've been talking about this. And um, how we are sends ripples, right? So we're neurocepting, because I'm going to use the polyvagal language. We're based on that, we're perceiving, which is conscious. Do I move in this way? Do I approach? Do I retreat? Do I do all those kinds of things? So we're also contributing to this fabric we can call society and culture. So socioception and culturalception, those are also at play. Like, how does the society around me constantly offer messages or cues that my autonomic nervous system, it's marinating in it? So I've started to look at it like, yes, there's the pureness of the autonomic nervous system, but there's also this constant dance of, it feels like marinating in a sauce, what society is saying. You're the right color, you're the wrong color. You're the right political party, you're the wrong political party. Our culture, which informs, like, dresses up our biology. So what I often challenge people to think about when I teach is, what are the messages that you are constantly picking up on? Pause for a moment. Where do you live? Put your feet on the ground, feel the earth, right? There's messages right there. News of the world. We've always been able to sense the earth through our feet. Pay attention. How are people moving? How do people act in Whole Foods versus Trader Joe's versus Albertsons? How do people drive where you are? That's becoming part of that. That's what you're marinating in. That's becoming part of how you react or respond. And what is your contribution? I love to challenge people to think about, what messages am I giving off that put texture and color into this environment that might promote someone else's feeling, I like to say, relatively safe, as safe as we can be in an uncertain world, or not, unsafe. What do I do? What do I exude? So I think we have a responsibility to self-regulation. I'll quote my friend Deb Dana, tracking, befriending the autonomic nervous system, getting to know how we respond to things. Why do I always flinch when that happens? Why do I have this thought about this person when that happens? And then what can we do, to state shift it? What can we do? Regulation is about shifting how we feel, but not just how we feel. How do I put that feeling into action? How is it going to play out in my next movement? In this world. So that's one of the ways that I'm considering what you've asked.
I think that's really important, especially during times of relative social turmoil or transition, where many of us feel quite uncertain
Yeah.
about the future and are casting around for, what do I do? Beyond macro level political action, you're talking about something very important, that, the way we regulate ourselves and the way we treat one another in every small little interaction does have ripple effects. It matters.
Yeah. I've been really tending to eye contact. I mean, I always try to sense into it, because there's many reasons that people don't want to make eye contact, but I've been, because I tend to be speedy, right? So that's one of my, I don't know. I've always, another thing, I've always just moved kind of quickly. And so I can forget to pause. Like I just remember very quick, this happened on Saturday. Long story short, I was supporting a colleague of mine. She's Danae, wonderful friend. She was holding a Indigenous art fair here, and I was helping with setup. And I was taking coffee orders because we had to set up so early in the morning. And I was walking up, my list. Like I used to wait tables. That's how I got through college. I'm like, what kind of coffee do you want? Also, I was like, wait a minute. Introduce yourself.
Mm.
Pause. I know this. I know this. And we were kind of in a hurry. But I said, let me start again. My name's Amber, and this is who I am, and this is why I'm here asking you this question. That took 5 seconds. Relationship, relationship. We always have the possibility to just pause, look in someone's eyes, smile, say hello. Um, Undo the busyness, right? I mean, trauma and busyness have a lot, I think, in common, right? We
Yeah.
can talk about it. It takes us out of our being very centered, present, open to what's right in front of us and being receptive and generous at the same
Right.
time.
To the extent to which we're frightened, we tend not to be generous in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Oh gosh, there's so many so many strands to this. Well, one of the things that you've been involved in that we haven't touched on that I want to make sure we touch on is forms of movement. The polyvagal therapy world does not necessarily include people involved with forms of touch and dance and a little bit more of the wild side of human history in terms of regulating our nervous systems. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. Well, it's a wild theory, right? It's about why. I mean, where does the autonomic nervous system? It's evidence of evolution. That's what I like to say. It's both a trail, it's what came before, and it's a path. It's guiding us forward. It's that pattern and possibility. It's wild. I love that the vagus nerve means wandering. I call it nomadic because I think there actually is a nomadic quality. I do think, one of the things I believe is that we're all here to be in service of evolution. So in that way, it's part of what's guiding us, and there are so many possibilities in any moment. And movement, I mean, movement is who we are, right? So, in a way, when we look at, I mean, any theory and for things to be understood and expressed, and I do this when I teach, I parcel it out, I compartmentalize. And what we're really talking about is movement. How did we become human? It's movement. What's the human experience? It's movement, it's migration. We've always moved. Geopolitical boundaries are crazy. I mean, we've always moved. And autonomic nervous system, right? Again, simplifying, but dorsal, the wisdom of being still, right? The wisdom, shutting down is a very uncomfortable and dangerous reaction for humans. And it's sourced from the 500 million year old when that circuit developed wisdom of being still, of being invisible. The sympathetic, 400 million years old, originating in the spinal cord, emanating out to the target organs, it's movement, right? And the spine, I mean, we're connected to vertebrates, but also movement became essential for survival. And as we moved along, movement also became essential for how we co-created societies, how we connected. And that's what the ventral is like. Okay, we actually need each other to survive. And survival is the foundation of thriving, of being connected. So there's a wildness to it. There's an evolutionary history here, and movement is at the core of it. It's the transition from this beautiful, sometimes beautiful, we can be still alone, to all of the ways we connect and move and dance and reach out, push, all the things that we do. So
I'm going to ask you just to provide our viewers some context because it occurs to me that there's probably a number of people watching who aren't familiar with Steve Porges's work, aren't familiar with polyvagal theory, and don't exactly know what you're talking about with ventral and dorsal and
okay.
all of that. Maybe back up just to give us a little bit of a framework.
Sure. So the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the entire nervous system in the human mammal body, and many people, not all people, but I do. I'm glad thank you for doing this, Ron, because I often ask people, have you heard of the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system, the branch, if you will, that's autonomic, automatic, right? That regulates us. And it has two branches, which more and more people are familiar with, sympathetic and parasympathetic. I remember in biology in the 80s learning sympathetic is movement and energy, fight or flight, parasympathetic, calm, homeostasis. So it's the branch of the autonomic nervous system that restores homeostasis. And Steve's work, I mean, it's so worth reading. I mean, there's so much to it, but if I'm always afraid to oversimplify, but as he, in his research, in my understanding, researching the parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve is a central part of the parasympathetic nervous system, and it has two complexes or circuits: the ventral, which is all these nerve fibers from the diaphragm up, and then the dorsal, which is the diaphragm down. And so these are nerve pathways. I sometimes call them circuits. I'm not sure that's totally accurate because circuits are closed and they're really pathways, but they connect to each other. But it's one long nerve, the vagus nerve, that's part of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the oldest part of it, which is 500 million years old, is belly. Just think belly, gut instinct, intuition, old wisdom. And it has what it affords us. It's recruited in time when we perceive life threat and feel terror, it's recruited to shut us down. So that's what I was referring to. It's the shutdown response. We'll go cold. Will our everything, heart rate, respiration will slow down. The ventral, which is the other part of the vagal, I'll call it circuitry, only 200 million years old, and it's only found in mammals. And it's, again, above the diaphragm, connects our heart to our face, and it has a lot to do with connection. So we really can, I mean, we sense whether features of safety is how we would say it. It's how we really sense the world, see the world, how the world sees us. In between the two is the 400 million-year-old sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic, but a different branch. And that's the fight or flight. Most people are familiar with that. So that, again, is what allows us to move when we need to. So I don't know if I did that as elegantly as I could have, but we're talking about three neural circuits that afford us evolutionarily based, tried and true strategies that increase the likelihood of our survival. Shutting down is the oldest. Moving to defend, to protect, to get out of the way is the next oldest. And then connecting, loving, staying close to those we love. That's the next one. So our nervous system is a path and a map of all of that.
And when we're doing dance or movement therapy, now that you've given us I'm going to ask you to come back to what you were just saying, but fit it into here. What are we shifting? What are we doing vis-a-vis these circuits or pathways?
So breath, movement, and dance, I like to think of them as a continuum, just like breath, sound, and movement are on a continuum. So every movement really starts with a breath. Dance is comprised of movement. Movement, the minute we move, I lift my arm, I drop it down, I turn my head. We're accessing the neurological underpinnings of everything: our beliefs, our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, all of that. Movement, the minute we move, we're no longer shut down. So we start to incite neurological pathways, right, to come back on if they've been off, if they've been quiet. So movement is a portal. It's a portal to the nervous system. Breath, because a lot of people are afraid of dance, right? People hear I'm a dance therapist, are like, oh, what do I have to dance? And I like to say dance is the creative mix. It's a creative expression of movement. So when we think about any of the things, I'll bring in the therapeutic world. When people come for therapy, any kind of therapy, they may choose somatic and dance movement therapy or not. But when they come for therapy, they're seeking change. So movement is a really efficient change maker. So is breath. Breath shifts the nervous system, regulates the nervous system more efficiently than anything else. I have learned that breath is sometimes scary for people. I think there's an intimacy to it. A lot of my clients, heard breathing as part of their perpetration, or it's just so deep when it gets dysregulated, it can be scary. We're not getting enough oxygen, which is a very scary feeling. Movement being on the next thing on that continuum, when we work with movement, we can start to portal into the breath and also portal out to relationship because movement is how we relate. It's how we hug. It's how we walk towards. It's how we turn away. It's how we put our hand on someone's back, right? So um, when you put movement in the mix, I think you're really bridging everything that's possible when there are things that we want or need to change in our lives because we feel fear
Mhm.
or because we feel terror, because we're immobilized and we can't go anywhere, because we're so afraid and fearful all the time. We just can't focus, right? Movement can be a bridge to more integration, more, I like to say holism. I think of social engagement as wholeness.
And you've been alluding to your work with folks who have been pretty badly injured in one way or another. How do you introduce folks who've been badly injured to things like movement in the service of autonomic regulation?
Autonomic regulation and liberation. I like to. It's movement is actually Mary Whitehouse is one of the, innovators in dance therapy of authentic movement, and she talked about, movement is not something we put on like a dress code. It's actually something that's been in us all along that liberates us. So, and it's an interesting question, Ron, because I remember when I first 1998, 99 went to the first gathering of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs and worked with survivors of torture for many years and introduced myself as a dance movement therapist. And people actually said, "Oh, you might hurt our clients. You can't work with our clients." There was this instant, you're not medical model enough. It's not, it was before the words evidence based were being uttered all the time. Over the years, I think a lot of my colleagues learned that actually, how can you not include movement and the body when the assault? So there's physical assault and injury and abuse, there's psychological, there's a mix of all of it, not just in torture, in child abuse, in ritual abuse, and all the many things that all of us work with. um, all of it affects the body. I often say that, especially with sadistic relational abuses and traumas, there is an intention by the perpetrator, right, to control, to oppress. The oppressors want to control our bodies and our movement. They intend to undermine safety and trust in relationship, right? I call it the love ladder, the love spiral. We have to feel safe enough, relatively safe enough to have the trust to engage in relationship that's meaningful and reciprocal, undermining the way, creating so much discomfort and pain and suffering in the body, turning the body often becomes the betrayer, right? In many abuses, we're intentionally dysregulated. I've worked with a lot of this. The Nazis who this is going to sound there, what they did, a lot of others who followed have used to understand how to really mess people up, starve people and then feed them a banquet, right? And then starve them again, mess up those internal rhythms of digestion, elimination, sleep. All of that is at play here. I call it our core rhythmicity. So that's all about movement. It's about the autonomic nervous system, the heart rate, the respiration, vascular feedback. It's also about how long it takes me to get out of bed in the morning, to walk across the room. Can I fully express myself, or am I, stiff? Is there a lot of pain? So working so in this work, one of the things that I've had to do when I recognized that movement was absolutely essential, because our movement changes when we're traumatized. We lose our beat. That's the simplest way to say it. Our movement changes, internal rhythms, which influence how we express. I've had to adjust the work a lot. And I will say that, when I graduated, I went right into torture treatment and working with war. I wish I knew some of the things now that I did then. A lot of what I teach, the polyvagal informed somatic and dance movement therapy, is a reflection of clients' courage. I messed up a lot.
Yeah.
I moved too fast. I pushed too hard, right? Because I,
But I think most most fields. I'll just speak for myself. That for me, in my own psychological development, almost always anything that helps me to reconnect more to what's happening inside, to be less defended, to be more present is a good thing. But that's because I'm not a victim of torture to that degree. And the gradual learning we do over the course of a career that whoops, what is really healing for one person may be too much for another at this moment in their life.
yeah, I mean, I talk about, I did a presentation, I think it was 2019, that was about the power of a single breath. I remember watching a woman who was perhaps the most shut down I've ever worked with. Her history was really hard to hear. None of the other clinicians in the program would work with her, not, not in an unkind way. It was so intense to sit with her. And I remember the moment where this became this,
Mm.
and just watching this little bit of ease, that's movement. So it's been a very humbling journey. And I think that's part of why, I mean, I first heard Steve speak in 1999 in Boulder, Colorado, and he was talking about drawing from his work with autistic individuals and autistic communities and talking about face to face interaction. I went, whoa, torture. And I asked a question, and he wanted to chat with me, and he's, extremely generous. I mean, here's a human being whose research is now so global, who really, the heart of it is that it matters, that it helps people. So he was really generous in helping me understand. And then my clients, I just started playing with movement practices, and so to come back to your original question, it does have to be titrated, it does have to be adjusted, it does have to be accessible to multiple. I'm going to use the word culture generously, right? Some people are very, movement and dance is part of their healing practice. For some of them, it's something that they don't do because of certain beliefs. So, I work with really structured practices that might take a second or 5 seconds or a minute. And I've had clients where we spend, an hour moving from floor to standing, in a spontaneous, creative, more or less guided process. So there's so many ways to work with movement. The tiniest ones, the micro movements, micro mobilizations, I call them. It's when the nervous system starts to spark and you don't even see it, you feel it. That's all part of it. So
Yeah. So speaking of practices, might you, and again, you've just said different folks need different things at different times, but nonetheless, might there be a practice with some wide applicability that you could, something brief that you could lead us through, knowing that many people are probably sitting at screens, right? And I don't know how free to move everybody is at the moment.
well, I think one of the it's called sternal breathing. It's very simple and straightforward, and it's quite impactful. I've adapted it from a woman named Rena Kornblum, one of my dance therapy colleagues. And to make a long story short, I'm just going to give the context. I was working with a group of children when I first started playing with this. So there's always the moment I decided to play with it. I had about 20 children in a kids group. The shared experience was war, different countries, different languages. We had interpreters. It was a movement therapy group. And there would be times where some of them would get activated and be really like hyper aroused, vigilant. Some of them would shut down. And this was one of those moments. And I was like, oh man, what do I do? Right. And I said to everybody, hey, everybody, let's just take a pause. Let's just sit down for a minute or stand. I gave them a choice of what posture or shape they were in. And we did this practice called sternal breathing. And what I've learned about it, and I've used it many more times, and I used it with my mom when she was dying and having panic attacks. I use it with myself. I use it on airplanes when it's turbulent, because I don't like that. It tends to help regulate us in a direction that's helpful. So here's the practice. So the first thing I like to do, and this is a neuroceptive practice, is invite everyone just to, for a moment, just notice how physically comfortable you are. Just notice your physical comfort. We can be quite conditioned in any, I'm going to call it classroom setting, even a Zoom interview that you might be watching while you're sitting in the bathtub, whatever. how we show up. So, are you really physically comfortable right now? And what adjustments can you make to increase that? If there are any adjustments you can make. So, exactly. We might need to roll shoulders, take a breath, uncross a leg. We might need to add a cushion, take a layer off, turn a fan on, drink water. Internal and external possibilities for how we can increase comfort. So we just refined our autonomic nervous system because we brought the state of our body into our conscious awareness. We took a moment to pay attention. One of my clients called this a micro empowerment because she said it for a moment, even if I can only do it for a moment, I feel more comfortable, more physically comfortable. And I know I'm here and I know I'm present. So we're actually supporting our neuroceptive capacities. Now I'm going to invite you to notice your breath, and we're going to take what I call a baseline, which is very simply a beginning point, a beginning moment. I started doing baselines because sometimes people didn't want to do the practices. They thought it was a little weird. If you take a baseline and then you do the same thing at the end of the practice, you can see if there's been a change. So the baseline is of your breath. And just notice how you're breathing. Notice how you notice this constant exchange with the universe, right? The inhale, the exhale, we're constantly exchanging the plant nation, the ocean nation, or just your breath. Is it a movement? Is it a sound? Is it a sensation? Is it a rhythm in a particular place in your body? You can be very practical about it as well. Is it fast or slow? And notice the relative comparative length of the inhale and exhale. In a balanced breath, they're kind of similar, never exact, but kind of. We can have a pattern in our breathing that's a really long inhale, which is sympathetic. I'm going back to that part of the nervous system that energizes. The exhale is parasympathetic, that calms, releases. So, what's your balance today? And how does it feel? Does it feel okay? And then here's the practice. Place your hand on your sternum, the bone right above your breast area. I like to call it the heart's shield. And just notice as you breathe if you feel movement in your sternum. It's kind of a mini baseline. Just notice that. Sometimes our sternum may not move, the muscles might be really tight, the tissue that it's nested in, and that's okay. There's never a demand for change in these practices. We notice what's there, or you might notice some movement, and the movement might have multiple dimensions. And what I'm interested in now is can you feel your sternum rise into your hand on the inhale? And can you feel it drop back down on the exhale? It kind of rests back into our body. Again, if that's not happening for you, that's okay. In body justice, we trust the wisdom of our body, the timing of it. It's just not what it's doing right now. But if you can feel that movement, and even if you can't, this is a practice we do no matter what we feel, but this is the movement. This is a primary movement of breath in the body. The practice is this. Start to press your sternum on the exhale. On the inhale, you release that press and just let your hand ride your sternum. On the exhale, you're pressing it. Don't press too hard. Sometimes, especially when I was working with those kids, they think it was funny to push really hard and make funny sounds. It is funny and it can be playful. I like to say 5 to 15% of your strength. It's kind of like the light attention in the contemplative practices, right? When we watch our exhale, you're just gently 5 to 15%, maybe 20% of your strength. In that range, what works for you? At any time, if this doesn't feel comfortable, if you don't like it, if it brings stuff up, you can let it go. If you want to keep going, you can keep going. There's no recipe for a certain number of exhales that we press our sternum on. I like to say just keep doing it until you feel like you're done. And sometimes people want to pause and rest and integrate. We integrate new neural pathways and therefore new wisdom when we rest, not when we're doing the thing, the movement. So And just notice, do you keep pressing or pushing with the same pressure? The 5% range is connective tissue, which is what contains us, but also what connects us. It's a big web of neural connection. If you get in the 10% range, you're going to be more in your voluntary muscles, the red muscles, the action muscles, sympathetic nervous system. Right? That's how we move. 15 to 20%, you might get down into your bones. And they're all of these have different effects. The pressure will determine whether this energizes you or calms you down. And then, whenever you're ready, you can let that go and just come back to noticing your breath. Compare it to the baseline, the relative comparative length of the inhale and the exhale. Are you breathing deeper, shallower, longer, shorter? Has anything shifted? Breath is the most efficient nervous system regulator. It is movement. I notice that I'm actually breathing, it feels bigger, wider, and deeper, and that I'm moving more with my inhales. Right? This is the basis of all movement is our breath. So no demand for change. If nothing changed, trust your body's wisdom. Sometimes change feels a little icky. We wish we didn't know that, but it could be useful information, and sometimes it feels helpful. So that's the practice. Sternal breathing, very simple. Hopefully the additional information was helpful. I like to weave the practice in.
Thank you. Yeah, no, very, very rich. And I will say it was sufficient parasympathetic activation that I had to remember, oh yes, I'm conducting an interview. Don't just drift off into sleep. Lovely.
Hopefully you can sleep if you want to take a nap now or later.
Yeah, I could use no, I would be able to. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. If people wanted to dive deeper into your work, where do you like to send them?
I have a website, www.ambergray.com. I'm on Facebook, Amber Gray Movement Therapies, and Amber Elizabeth Gray is more my personal one. That's where my activism shows up. Amber Gray Movement Therapies is my work. Yeah, and there's different, I think there's links on my website for Instagram and all those things, the social media that I do a little bit of learning to do more.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this,
Thank you.
truly wide-ranging and integrative look at ourselves, the world, and your work.
Thank you so much, Ron. It's been really lovely.